So this is a very special morning, and it's just wonderful to have the mayor here. But first let me introduce and recognize our local mayor, Mayor Dinkins. Please stand up so we can say good morning. So this is the David Dinkins Leadership and Public Policy Forum, which has had a very distinguished history here at Columbia. We are thrilled to have David as part of our family. Every time you have the chance to see David, whether at an event like this or around the campus, your day is just better because you've seen him. I want to say just a few brief things. We have Merit Janow, who is the Dean of the School of International Public Affairs, will come up shortly. She's just doing a fantastic job of leading the school, which is really the part of Columbia that has the expertise and the focus on public policy, which of course is the center of today's discussion about cities, and Merit really wants to take SIPA more in that direction. So we're all thrilled about that. Ester Fuchs is also here, and of course she has a history of service in the city and teaching and scholarship here, and leads the program on urban planning, design, all questions policy related to cities. It is a great thing to have the mayor here. And I just want to say something very briefly. It seems to me he has exactly the right issues to highlight, especially at this time. How do we help very young children, especially before they go into school, and how do we help them during that time, especially in after-school programs, and how do we deal with very, very serious questions of inequality, of benefits, and life that our society offers to children. Just 2 days ago, the United States Supreme Court decided that it is constitutional for states to effectively bar policies of affirmative action in public universities across the United States. There are now about 10 states in the country that have acted to amend their constitutions or a few other methods to make it virtually impossible for public universities to consider race and ethnicity in their admissions process. Fortunately, the underlying program of affirmative action, which all colleges and universities, including this one, of course, have followed for the past 40, 50 years, fortunately, those are still constitutional. But the Schuette decision of 2 days ago will embolden people to continue this process of trying to amend state constitutions to ban affirmative action. I say this because it's of a piece with this big question about the segregation and the resegregation of American public schools throughout the United States. And New York State recently was identified as having the most serious problem of de facto segregation. But recent reports have pointed out that in the South, many schools are more segregated school systems than they were actually before Brown. This is a huge social question. How are we going to address this? And for the mayor to come in and to identify this as a core set of issues, I think is really critically important. And whatever one thinks about the 14th Amendment analysis of the Schuette decision 2 days ago, the fact of the matter is the country is left with a massive problem that we're going to have to continue addressing, and I'm afraid that we have not really recognized the full extent of the problem. Hence, we are extremely pleased, at least I am, about where the mayor stands on this and the policies he wants to introduce. So it's my pleasure to give you Merit Janow, who will introduce the mayor. Merit.
Good morning, and thank you, President Bollinger. It's my pleasure to welcome our guests on behalf of Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. You know, SIPA is really proud of our 17th annual David Dinkins Leadership and Public Policy Forum, which has provided a wonderful vehicle for analysis, focus, and dialogue around the dynamic elements of urban policies. And we are, of course, especially proud today to welcome back to campus one of our most prominent alumni, Mayor Bill de Blasio, who earned his Master's of International Affairs at SIPA in 1987. And to prepare for this my remarks today, I was looking into our files around Mayor de Blasio, and I reread a SIPA news profile of him from 2001 when he was running for New York City Council. And I should say that if you look that up, you'll see a picture of him with a full beard, young, handsome guy with a full beard. And in that profile, you'll see that he says he intended to work in areas of U.S. foreign policy, especially around Latin America. But he was pulled into city politics by joining Mayor David Dinkins' campaign in 1988. And he said in that profile of that decision that it was an unusually harmonious and energetic campaign, and it felt as much like a social movement as a campaign. And as we engage with urban policy leaders from New York City and around the world, we see how increasingly local policy often reifies the aspirations of more global social policy movements, and also how local policy can have important implications internationally. And for New York, of course, what happens in New York City often does not stay in New York City. And issues of social justice, education, economic inequality, sustainability, affordable housing, issues which Mayor de Blasio has highlighted are also international in nature. So the Dinkins Forum has also shown this very powerfully as each year we engage with issues of local impact, often with global implications. I also want to thank Mayor David Dinkins for his leadership in bringing conversations about the future of urban policy to SIPA and to the university at large. He has been on our faculty at SIPA since 1994, teaches courses that are hugely powerful and compelling, and he has inspired many of our students. And his experiences can also be appreciated through his wonderful recent memoir, A Mayor's Life. And he has really enriched our community immeasurably. We're very pleased to share this event with you. Welcome, Mayor Dinkins. Thank you.
The dean has a pressing appointment in Washington and has been good enough to spend some time with us, so she needs to leave very shortly, and we all understand. She looked so good this morning, I told her I thought she was going to Washington to participate in a movie, and she was the star. She assured me that that was not the case. I'm so pleased to see so many friends here. The custom among my friends of South Africa, the diplomats, is to say, usual protocols observed, and you don't bother acknowledging people, but I don't want to lose my job, so Dean, thank you so much President Bollinger, I'm so happy that you're here with us. You didn't really need to get a new suit for this, but I'm glad you did. I thank all of you for joining us today for the 17th Annual David Dinkins Leadership Forum. We're anxious to hear from our keynote speaker and to exchange ideas with our excellent panel, so I will be brief. I've known Herbert Bloch for most of his life. He was 12 years old when we met. He's right down here in front. He is now the Assistant Executive Vice President of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. I'm told it is the most important Jewish organization we have. He's right here in front because I wanted him to be where I could see him and I could point him out to you, because back in 1984, or about that time, Herb chose not to take the advice I've given him. We've been friends since he literally was 12 years old, and he came and asked me whether or not he should work in the Mondale campaign or whether he should stay in school. And I counseled that he should stay in school because there's always going to be another election. He did not take my advice. Instead, he worked in the Mondale presidential campaign. And if you wonder where I'm going with all this, it was in that role that he met one Bill de Blasio. After a few years had passed and they both moved on down different paths, the time came when Bill de Blasio returned to New York City and set about in search of a job. In so doing, he reached out to his old friend Herb. After many attempts at getting an appointment, Herb was successful finally in bringing him into the campaign offices in '89 to meet with our Rumple genius Bill Lynch. Many of you here know Bill or knew him. He has gone his reward now. Bill Lynch spent 5 minutes with Bill de Blasio and said, "You're hired." So for those of you who like what Bill de Blasio is doing, give Herb Bloch the credit. I want to go back even further to note that I originally met Bill Lynch through Basil Patterson. You'll see the photo over yonder of the so-called Gang of Four. I was running for borough president. In fact, I ran in '77, '81, and '85. People used to say to me, "What do you do?" And I say, "I run for borough president." Well, Basil told me, "Dave, what you need is Bill Lynch." And so it was Basil Patterson, who was a good friend, and we were law partners, and he and Bill Lynch were two of the best friends anyone could ever have. We had a funeral yesterday for Basil. One of his sons, Daniel, is over yonder. Many of you here knew Basil, so you know what a great man he was. It is said that service to others is the rent we pay for our space on earth, and both Bill Lynch and Basil certainly departed us paid in full. So as we rounded the corner of planning for this forum, it was the passing of Basil last week that led us to conversations and thoughts about dedicating this forum to the life that Basil lived. And the knowledge that as we move forward with our own lives, we must always understand the true measure of achievement is the numbers of others we lift up along the way, as Basil always did. So, Daniel, please tell your mommy, Portia, that this is for him. and frankly, it's the least we can do. I always ask my students and young people to give back some measure of that which they have received, and I encourage them to have an interest in public service, always using care to point out that by public service, I'm not talking about government and politics alone, although appropriately done, that is public service. But I tell them I don't care whether it's the NAACP or the Red Cross, do something. And I'm pleased to note in this audience this morning, I see a lot of people who do just that. Debbie Beal of Posse Foundation, wonderful good work that it has done. And Erwin Redlener, the founder of the Children's Health Fund. And there's so many of you, Mrs. Diallo, God bless you. And there, you all know about Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. His little brother is with us, Andrew Goodman's brother, David, and there is a Andrew Goodman Foundation, and many of you here, there are others whose names I will not mention, like the fighter pilot, Roscoe Brown, a Tuskegee Airman, the first, at age, I guess about 22, first of his group to shoot down a German jet flying a prop many years ago. So there are many of you here who believe in those kinds of things, and I encourage our students to think about doing something for somebody else. And every now and then somebody will come to me and say that, because I have the good fortune of having a lot of these folks, some of whom I named, come and lecture for me, and they may meet them, and they really are important people, and so they decide to involve themselves in some form of public service. So to my friend Basil, who's up there waiting for me now, you see, Percy Sutton was the oldest, and then Basil, then me, then Charlie, so I'm next. But I'm ready. Dick Ravitch, I'm ready. Dick Ravitch has a book out Tuesday, and I haven't seen it yet, but I know it's going to be good. So with all that I've said in mind, we dedicate the discussion today among the dawning of our new mayor and the forward thinkers on the panel that follow his keynote address. We dedicate this forum to the legacy of Basil A. Patterson. That's an applause line, you folks. See my godson in the audience there, Dr. Leslie Haley. And so I thought you would start the applause at the appropriate time. You let me down. This university is called Columbia University in the city of New York. I mean, that's the formal name, in the city of New York. We are specifically identified and embedded right into the fibers of this great city. This greatest living laboratory for all of the service and urban policy work there could ever be, right here at home. And those of you here today who don't already know, Dr. Ester Fuchs will get to meet her a little later when she comes out to moderate the panel. As you have been told, Dr. Fuchs is no stranger to the inner workings of city government. Having served as a special advisor to Mayor Bloomberg, she's a prolific author, commentator, one of the true great minds of our city, and SIPA, where she serves as the director of our urban policy concentration and teaches yet another generation of students. Within Columbia University, SIPA is at its own complex and gorgeous mosaic, a microcosm of a city so unique that I have always said it makes being the mayor of New York City the best job in the world. It's better than being mayor of any city anywhere in the world. It's better than being governor of any state, including New York State. And the only job that's better is the one that Obama has, and of late I'm beginning to wonder about that. But that's what Bill de Blasio is. He's mayor of this great city. And I would like to believe that some of that which he learned at the feet of Bill Lynch and here at SIPA informs his judgments. We've put on 16 previous forums, and we've had the whole list of wonderful speakers join us over the years. But this year, it gives me the greatest pleasure to stand here with all of you right now to bring all of this history and legacy together under the roof of Columbia University in the city of New York. And I ask that you all give a warm welcome, a welcome home, as it were, to our own SIPA graduate, the Honorable Bill de Blasio, 109th Mayor of the City of New York. Go get him, Tiger.
Well done. Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor.
And be sure to say hello.
I will. Thank you. Thank you very much. Please, please. Well, I have some things to say about my former boss, Mayor Dinkins, and I'll do that in a moment. I have some things to say about what's happening in this city right now and where we're going. But first, let me observe the protocols in a very quick manner. But I want to give credit and thanks to the president of this great university, Lee Bollinger, for his leadership. I want to thank Mayor Janow for her leadership of my alma mater at SIPA. Yes, there you go, SIPA. I want to commend, you have an all-star panel today of folks who are going to be talking about the issues at hand, including Ester Fuchs, who escaped from city government and made it to Columbia University, or maybe I guess went back and forth between the two. Jennifer Jones-Austin, who did an incredible job co-chairing our transition, and I want to thank her for helping us build the team that we have today. Dick Ravitch, who's one of the greatest voices of fiscal responsibility, yet with a progressive soul that you're going to find anywhere in this country. Bruce Ratner has done extraordinary things for Brooklyn and for this city. I want to thank him for the work we've done together. Dorian Warren, a very powerful voice in our national debate, and MSNBC star. So I said, should I tell them the new phrase I coined? I said to Dorian backstage, I said, the new thing is, I appear on MSNBC, therefore I am. That is the new standard for our society. I want to talk about the mayor, but Mayor Dinkins is right. The loss of Basil Patterson is, if you've looked carefully at the history of the city over the last few decades, the history of the state, Basil Patterson is one of the people who really created the reality we now live in terms of some of the best, most progressive, most important developments. He played such an extraordinary role in everything that occurred on the way to the creation of the Dinkins administration and during it and in the aftermath to sustain a lot of the progress we made. He played such a crucial role in helping to build the progressive labor movement in this city. Someone who didn't get headlines that in any way, shape, or form correlated to the impact he made. But I can tell you, I was in this situation, as with so many others. We sought out Basil always. He was the wisest. He had the progressive activist soul with the wisdom and the understanding of how things worked, and he was often the one guy who could tell us how to get there. So he will be deeply missed, but I guarantee you his thinking lives on with all of us. Mayor Dinkins, I have to say the most obvious thing. I don't think I would be in this position today if it weren't for you. I don't think I could have done the things I did if you had not been willing to hire a young, impressionable SIPA graduate, learning my way, you gave me my first real chance in government. And I thought I was going to work for you, going into public service per se. I did not know that I was actually enrolling in a second degree program, because New York City Hall will teach you things very, very quickly about the realities of public life. And it's an incredibly sobering, clarifying place. I would argue it may be the greatest graduate school in the world in that context. But what I learned with the honor of serving Mayor Dinkins, I learned what was possible. I certainly learned, and we all learned, very difficult lessons about the roadblocks that are put in the way of any effort to foster greater equality, to reach people in need, to address some of the blatant biases and the discrimination that still pervades society. We, in the Dinkins years, had the honor of serving a leader who wanted to take those challenges on head on, and boy, he felt the impact of the opposition to the changes he sought to make. But in that process, all of us learned. That fight strengthened a lot of us, and a lot of us, instead of feeling in the context of the challenge that maybe public service was too hard or too frustrating, a lot of us came out of the experience of the Dinkins years energized to go do more, to fulfill the vision that the mayor started to put into place. And so, Mr. Mayor, I want to thank you for being an inspiration to me, for having opened that door for me. I want to most especially say it's very simple when you can say what was the most important thing that happened in your life. Well, the most important thing is that I worked for Mayor Dinkins, and I was minding my own business one day, and a young woman walked up to me who was working in the City Hall press office. I had never met her before. She asked me for some information. I looked up at her, as I like to say. I heard violins. I heard angels singing. Apparently a thunderbolt hit me. And Charlene McCrae did not feel any of those things. It took a substantial process for me to encourage her to feel any of that whatsoever. But eventually, it all worked out. And because of Mayor Dinkins, I met my wife of now 20 years. And if you appreciate my daughter Kiara's strong soul and her forceful desire to make this world better, and if you appreciate my son Dante's incredible gravitas at the age of 16 and his epic hair, then yes, you should thank Charlene, but really you have to thank Mayor Dinkins for making it all possible. So thank you, Mayor Dinkins. And Mayor Dinkins referenced my good friend Herbert Bloch. It's true. I just want to say to any of the students in the room, life is serendipitous. I was working at a nonprofit. Someone heard that they had a friend of a friend who was looking for someone to take a job on the Mondale campaign in 1984. That's precisely how I got to the Mondale campaign in 1984, met Herbert Bloch, and then one day he said, "Hey, David Dinkins is about to announce for mayor. You should come join us." And yes, I did go to interview with Bill Lynch, and Bill Lynch, extraordinary, like Basil Patterson, one of the people who did extraordinary things for the city, taught a whole generation of us how to do this work. We reference him to this day, to this hour, in the work we do. A lot of us quote him frequently because it's so present. I think a lot of people in this room have been to job interviews. Sometimes you get that curveball question. My opening question from Bill Lynch that day in 1989, he looked at me, looks me up and down, pauses and says, "What do you know about New York City politics?" And I thought, wow, that's open-ended. So I struggled to offer a few thoughts. I guess it was sufficient, and here I am. One other thing I want to say as I reflect on the journey that led me to Mayor Dinkins, I had an important experience at SIPA. Even though what I studied at the time, I studied Latin American affairs, I thought that was the direction I was going in. Obviously, things changed. My wife always says to me that a master's in international affairs is necessary to be mayor of New York City, given the incredible diversity of this city and given that we're such a global capital. But I will tell you, in those days at SIPA, I ended up learning more about the industrialization of Mexico than I ever imagined I would, and many other fascinating topics. And it built a foundation in ways that I couldn't realize till much later, that allowed me some of the insights to be able to first survive and then I hope thrive in the maelstrom that was City Hall, first as a staffer and now in this role today. What we saw then, and I want to link it to what I want to talk about today, what we saw then was that there, in the vein of leadership, there's very little to be said, in my opinion, for too much devotion to incrementalism or too much self-editing, self-limitation. Mayor Dinkins came into a situation, was handed a situation with a truly rampant crime problem. There were a lot of ways to look at what could be done. There was a lot of cynicism at that time, a lot of sense that perhaps our reality was just part of our lives and wasn't going to change. Mayor Dinkins had the audacity to say we could in fact address the problem, but it would take an entirely different kind of investment. And he suggested very boldly a program called Safe Streets, Safe City. This may be reminiscent to some of you. It was a bold program. It was going to cost a substantial amount of money. It was going to greatly change the lives of people in this city, and it required the approval of Albany. And many, many people said that would be impossible. Mayor Dinkins, to his great credit, persevered. And we got that program passed, and it was the beginning, the foundation. I want to make this very clear, not just a beginning in the small step sense, the foundation of everything that happened thereafter, the 20 years of extraordinary progress on public safety in this city. It would not have happened if Mayor Dinkins had said, guys, we just can't go that far. The market won't bear it. We have to take small steps. Maybe we could pilot something here or try something there. It only happened because he said we have to go the whole distance right now. So if you appreciate how safe this city is, and I guarantee you we're working every single day to keep crime low, to continue to ensure this is a safe city, and to repair the relationship with police, between the police and community simultaneously, and yes, those two things can be done at once. If you appreciate the safety of this city, if you appreciate 20 years of sustained progress, then join with me for a moment to applaud the man who got it all started, Mayor Dinkins. Now this segues into what I want to talk about leadership, and I think I have to contextualize it very briefly by saying this is a time in history where I think the bold are needed. The fact is, at the local level, we've been handed a series of challenges. We don't have a lot of natural allies in the way we might have in the past. The most evident missing link is the federal government. So for cities around the country, there's often a sense of we have what we have to address our problems. We have each other in the sense of a lot of cities have common interests, are working together, but we don't have the federal partner we usually had in the past. We have it only from time to time now. And so in that sense, it links back to the question of, well, in the face of such intense challenges as we face today, the crucial challenges of income inequality, the environmental challenges, the infrastructure challenges, we could say we are therefore reduced to less because we don't have the partnership and support we deserve. Or alternately, we could say we have to go create a new paradigm. We have to do it on the ground, city by city. We have to create something that then bubbles up and changes the debate around us and above us and changes the rules of the game. I think that is the prescription, and in fact the only path we have. And it again would be tempting to say, in light of these challenges, don't overcommit, don't try and go too far, look at your limitations, but that's a luxury we can't afford because the problems are so great. We have no choice but to push the spectrum, to find out just how much each city can achieve on its own and what the linking of those efforts might mean for all of us. And I don't say this without reference to history. I think it's clear in so much of history that the changes come from the grassroots. The changes come because there's a demand. I was very gratified by what the dean said about our campaign seeming more like a social movement than a campaign. That's the ultimate compliment. And that, to me, has a ring of truth, because I think what we've always believed, what I've always seen, is if you develop and channel the demands of the people on the ground, that is your greatest prospect for some kind of real lasting social change. It's not typical of governmental structures to be ahead of the people. It's typical that those structures have to be pushed by the people to the places that actually, the policies, the changes that actually reflect a response to the lives of people on the ground. So first, I work from the assumption that the grassroots ultimately are where the action is. And that correlates to the notion that cities have a particular role to play because we are simply closer to the ground, more connected to the people we serve. We feel the urgency of their needs and their demands. And if we channel that accurately, it leads us to action. But history also grounds us because, in this state in particular, we had the best examples, I would argue, in all of American history, of innovation, creativity, audacity in the face of crisis. I'm going to talk for just a brief moment about some of the titans of this state's history, people like Al Smith and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Theodore LaGuardia, and I want to say it because at the time they were entirely in uncharted territory. It's easy today to look at the history and think, oh, these were great men, great accomplishments, frame so much of our lives to this day. The work of those three is reverberating around this city as we speak. The core accomplishments of Franklin Delano Roosevelt frame everyday life in America today. But at the time, each of them was somewhere on an uncharted path, surrounded by critics and cynics, without a map, and innovating things that previously had not even existed. And I hope that is felt deeply, not adding to a particular current in policy or amending or burnishing, but creating whole new veins, whole new ideas about what government should do for people, could do for people. And there's an audacity in that. There's a quality of inventiveness and creativity, which I hope all of us in public service cherish and strive for. And so look at the examples, because they're quite striking. Al Smith, he could have been a typical machine politician. That's the milieu he came out of. He comes up through the ranks, but he was an extraordinarily gifted man, and he had a good set of eyes and ears, and he saw the world around him. He saw the overcrowded tenements. He saw working conditions that were fundamentally dangerous. Famously, he witnessed one of the greatest tragedies in the history of this city, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. It was 103 years ago. And he saw 146 people die because of unsafe working conditions, primarily immigrant women. And Al Smith went much farther than the conventional wisdom would have dictated, or that his trajectory would have suggested, and that was not just that he became governor of this state, but he, based on his actual life experience, increasingly believed there had to be a response from government. An unacceptable set of dynamics existed, and government had to go places it had not gone, and he pushed through a flurry of labor reforms and was one of the great innovators. Notions like making factories safe, making sure there were exits, making sure there were sprinklers. He was one of the leaders in efforts to reform working hours and child labor, and all this came from his experience. And a lot of it at the time, I know it sounds impossible to believe right now, a lot of it at the time was highly controversial. A lot of it at the time seemed undoable, or if it was to be done, it would be done over a long period of time. But he sensed the urgency of the need, he sensed the moment where change could happen, and he pressed with extreme intensity. And suddenly, the entire playing field was reset. The entire set of assumptions were reset. And he was followed in office by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who again, if you looked at his history, you might not have expected what you ultimately got. Obviously a man of means, not someone who had previously distinguished himself as a particularly aggressive reformer, but he had a great mind and he had an incredible empathy. And when this country experienced its worst economic crisis in our history, in the Great Depression, you can imagine the sense of confusion, the feeling that pervaded this country, that suddenly we were all lost together. I've talked over the years to my older relatives who went through those years. Talked to people for whom it was 40, 50 years in the past, and yet in their voices was a sense, a very present, urgent sense, that everyone suddenly felt unmoored, and they didn't know a way out. And Roosevelt suggested, first in New York State, he showed that there was a way the government could actually reach out, provide immediate relief to people, play a role in getting people back to work, do things that had never been in the purview of government before on any appreciable scale. First, he showed it could be done by a state. That encouraged, energized the whole nation to start thinking differently. And then, upon his elevation to the presidency, he literally redefined the notion of our federal government and the notion of the role of government in general in our society. And if you look at those times, if you look at the speed with which Roosevelt and his team were innovating, all of it reaching out into the unknown and creating structures and ideas, pushing forward to places that people hadn't been before, but having the faith that the response was what was needed. And that's what's so brilliant about all this set of leaders. They started with the assumption that the one thing that was absolutely unacceptable was lack of response to people's needs. That silence or inaction was the most unacceptable possibility. And that they would build, they would experiment, sometimes they would fail. But that there had to be a clear forward motion visible to all, and that was in one measure about solving people's material needs, and in another measure about re-engendering hope. I love to brag about a book. I liked the author so much I hired him, Adam Cohen. The book is called Nothing to Fear. It's about the group of advisors and leaders around Roosevelt in those 100 days, those famous 100 days. And I urge everyone to read it because you get a look inside the laboratory, inside the workshop, as people literally were creating whole ideas. Things like Social Security and Medicaid, all the ideas that have come over time. The Civilian Conservation Corps, they didn't exist before, they had to make them up on the spot. But that willingness to do that is what turned this country around. And finally, with LaGuardia, no disrespect to Mayor Dinkins, no disrespect to me, but I think Fiorello LaGuardia will always be our most beloved mayor. And I think the reason is that in that maelstrom, in that moment of profound crisis, he provided a way forward. He did it, of course, with a particular personality and energy that epitomizes all that's good about New York. But remember, LaGuardia is in the same exact moment as Roosevelt, the same exact crisis. It's hitting here in a profound way because the financial industry based here has collapsed. So many of the assumptions the city was built on were suddenly wobbly. So much poverty, so much pain, and LaGuardia says, I'm going to take what Roosevelt has started and I'm going to do it here, and we're going to do our own version of it, and we're going to create whole new things that haven't been seen at the local level. So he not only took the strands of the New Deal and made them real and vivid in New York City and proved they could work and helped create the groundwork for them to work elsewhere in the country, he was that perfect partner for Roosevelt, taking the big ideas, the big thrusts, and making them real and local and tangible for people in need. But on top of that, he decided to create whole new structures of his own, like the New York City Housing Authority. And to put it in perspective, Fiorello LaGuardia created the New York City Housing Authority, which today houses almost 500,000 people. He did that 1 month after taking office, in the middle of the greatest economic crisis in the history of this country. So that's the kind of audacity that actually changes things and changes them in a lasting way. Let me take you quickly to the present day. I wish there weren't so many parallels, but there are. The greatest economic crisis in the history of the country, the Great Depression, the second greatest, I don't think it's particularly arguable, I think it's clear, was the economic crisis that we experienced over the last 5-6 years. We don't need to be reminded of the depth of that crisis. We don't need to be reminded how many people are hurting. We don't need to be reminded that income inequality is at its greatest point since the Great Depression and growing. But, of course, we get reminded more and more, and the proof keeps coming out. And so just in the last week, you may have seen the international study reported in the New York Times pointing out that the American middle class that had been the exemplar of the world was no longer the strongest middle class on this globe, was starting to decline in international perspective, a further proof of that which we've all been feeling now over decades, the profound decline of what was supposed to be the foundation of the country and was for decades. Our middle class weakening all the time. For folks who are lower income, the situation even worse. In the middle of my campaign last year, I was talking about a tale of two cities. I was arguing the case, I was arguing the things we had to do, and right in the middle of that, the city government report came out showing that 46% of New Yorkers were at or near the poverty level. And for a lot of people, it seemed impossible until you did the math and looked at the fact that with constant downward pressure on wages and benefits and the kind of cost of living we have here, it was inevitable that more and more people would fall behind and would start to approach levels that only can be described as poverty. Against that backdrop, we said, okay, we come into office with the notion that our forebears, our exemplars, did things boldly, they did them audaciously, they did them quickly because there was no other choice. They didn't wait. They didn't wait for some other force to step in. They didn't worry that it might not all be perfect or the criticisms that would come from any missteps. They said, if we don't experiment and act now, if we don't thrust forward, if we don't create, that pain only deepens. And our job is to try to respond and relieve the pain and the suffering of our people. So in our way, we've tried humbly, in smaller, less dramatic ways, but I hope important ways, to follow that good example from our forebears. We passed legislation to provide paid sick leave to 500,000 more New Yorkers, because that's something. That's something that provides a little more economic security, a little bit more ability for people to have consistency in their pay, a little more relief when people are sick. We went to Albany, and after a long and often dramatic fight, we got funding for full-day pre-K for every child in this city. And that will change people's lives, because for hard-working people, a little more security, knowing their child will get a strong start, knowing they won't have to pay from a bank account that doesn't have much left in it, that they'll get that for free. It's something they can depend on. It's something that'll build their child's life, and by the way, will give their child a greater possibility of being economically vital later on in their own lives. Some greater chance at fairness and equality because the educational foundation was strong and equal. In a few days, we're going to announce the details of a plan to create 200,000 units of affordable housing for this city. I imagine a number of people in this room would like to sign up for the opportunity to partake of that affordable housing, because if I can tell you, every time I go around this city, I went all last year, every time I go on the subway to this day, the thing that people raise the most is that need for affordable housing, that fear of being priced out of the city they love, that deep, deep desire to stay here with their family and friends and be a part of this, but that sense that it may be slipping away. Our response is as big and as bold as we can possibly reach. 200,000 units over 10 years. Some people call it difficult, some people call it ambitious, a few kind people have called it slightly crazy. We say it is the outer limit, and that's what we have to reach for, and we know we'll get there if we demand it of ourselves. And addressing inequality takes many forms. The one that's so particularly urgent and deeply felt are those pieces that are about economics. But there are so many others. We're doing with pre-K and after-school programs is about addressing educational inequality as well. What we're doing in terms of the relationship between police and community is to address a whole other set of inequalities and injustices that needed a response. And by the way, I always felt that if we brought police and community closer together, that if we created policies that instead of shunning and degrading our young men of color, uplifted and supported and respected them, that we would have a stronger and safer society. And so we have made fundamental reforms. We've moved away from the broken stop and frisk policy. We've ended practices around racial profiling and surveillance that were clearly unfair. And you know what? Crime continues to stay low. And people can feel that they, every single day, are working more closely with the police. And so the critics suggested a whole series of dangerous possibilities and unintended consequences if we were to go down that audacious path. But we went there because we knew it was necessary, because we heard the voices of people, because we heard the challenges they faced every day, and we had faith that addressing people's needs would actually lead us to a safer place, and we see it before our very eyes. And we know that in this city, this most diverse of cities, the ultimate immigrant city, the place that epitomizes the notion of immigration and diversity as a strength, we know that we have 500,000 of our fellow New Yorkers who happen to be undocumented, and we have to embrace them, and so we'll create a municipal ID program to dignify them and give them opportunity as well. I'll finish with this thought. All of the challenges around us require that strong, consistent response. They require creativity, and I marvel at the creativity of those who came before us. And I aspire just to reach some of their level and hope I can follow in their footsteps modestly. But I'll tell you something. Some of it is just listening and feeling what we're going through. I'll give you another example. We have obviously a crisis of climate change, and there are things we can do about it, and it's not just a big, insurmountable international problem. It is ultimately a problem that comes down to every country, every state, every city. And the question is, are we doing all we can locally and in our lives as individuals to address it? And that parallels this crisis of economic inequality. And again, we could throw up our hands in the face of that, or we could say we have real tools in government to address that, like some of those that we've started to implement. Well, I think those two strands have to go together. We're going to fight the problems of climate change. We're going to fight for a cleaner environment while simultaneously addressing the economic difficulties of our people and the deepening of income inequality. We have to see environmental sustainability in the same vein as economic sustainability. We have to marry those two ideas. And so, one of the things I look forward to doing is retrofitting our public buildings. We've got a lot of them. Our public schools, our public housing authority buildings. Retrofitting those, and guess what? Hiring people from those neighborhoods, from those developments to do the work. We're addressing the aftermath in the same vein we're addressing the aftermath of Sandy. So many people still afflicted, so many people came from working class neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods. Thank God there's some federal funding to address this, and guess what? Let's use that money to hire people affected by the storm to fix their own homes, their own neighborhoods. So that's how we bring the strands together. And so long as we believe that audacity is the path we're called to, that we can solve a lot more locally than we're given credit for, all of us have to remember, if we're not given a meaningful response from the highest level of our national government, it's an open invitation to us to create, to believe in ourselves, to believe in what we might do, to realize we don't have a choice but to press ahead, to see how far our creativity might take us, to see what might be out there we have not yet realized, and ultimately to know that perhaps our example, our audacity, our unwillingness to retreat will someday animate a bigger discussion, a bigger debate, will someday light a fire underneath our public servants in Washington and convince them that it's their obligation to respond, despite their partisan differences, despite their career needs, to actually find a meaningful response for the people of this country. Until that day, in the vein of so many of our young people in neighborhoods like Williamsburg and Bushwick, we'll do it ourselves. We'll make something happen here. We'll show it can be done. We'll honor our obligation to our own people. And we'll remember there's a rich, rich history of the people knowing what the problem is well before the public debate acknowledges it, of the people seeing the solution well before the leaders feel comfortable embracing it or safe embracing it, the people leading and the leaders eventually following. We want to spark that notion in all we do. The people are demanding something of us. Their leadership has to be honored. Their voice has to be honored. I finish with a quote that I love from a quintessential New Yorker, the great playwright Tony Kushner, who wrote in his extraordinary play, Angels in America. Simple, simple notion he put forward. He said, "The world only spins forward." We just have to recognize that. We have to capture that energy and momentum and provide the kind of changes the people simply demand of us. Thank you. Do I get a question or two?
I once put a question to you. As a matter of fact, we were here at Columbia, and somebody in the press said that you threw me a bouquet and I shot back an arrow. Well, that will not be the case this morning. Now, I just wonder if you agreed with me that SIPA has at its hands, because we're here in the city of New York, the greatest laboratory ever, anywhere. And I believe that we can do things with these bright young students here who observe what goes on in our city. And I think that a greater effort needs to be made by us at Columbia University in the city of New York.
Well, I say amen. The mayor is right again. I had an incredible experience at SIPA. I learned a lot. It helped prepare me for everything I was able to do. But I have to say, I think that's exactly right. I think the education here doesn't take the same route if it's not connected to the real practice and the real dynamic of this city. I couldn't agree more. As I said, the time I had the honor of spending with you, I think another way of saying my experience in City Hall it was 4 years, and I think that's 28 years in people years. That's you learn in a very concentrated manner, and and the intensity of it. But that to me is a little bit of a microcosm. I left here in 1987. I had the honor of going to work for you in 1989 on the campaign, 1990 in City Hall, and the practical learning takes root in a very different way. So my argument would be, yes, anyone here needs to marry their experience with the communities around, with the opportunities that abound in this city, and start practicing on the spot. Don't just have an academic experience, meet some nice people, and then go off looking for a future. Integrate that experience into the life of the city from the very beginning. And it's a running start. It deepens, it makes the academic insights so much more powerful if you're actually applying them as we speak. And I assure you, whether it's in city government or so many other places, there are so many organizations that would love to get SIPA students involved with them and bringing their talents to bear. So I couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor, for those really inspirational remarks. I think they're appropriate in Low Library, probably one of the most inspirational places in the city of New York. In the interest of time, I've been asked to provide for you 3 questions from our students. We've had many more, and they can write to you at City Hall. I thought we'd just focus you on 3 questions relating to education. The first one really is simply about how you plan on tackling the graduation rate of high school students in New York City. This is a national problem, but we have it here in New York as well. The second question relates to charter schools. What do you plan on doing in the future on these issues that divide the public schools from the public charter schools? And the third question really relates to higher education, which is, given the nature of our more sophisticated economy, how are we going to get more of our kids into universities? Thank you so much.
Could you ask broader questions, please? Okay, here we go. I think you should have said, what is the meaning of life? Here we go. On the graduation rate, I think there's some strands running through all of these, but I'll try and bring it together quickly. On the graduation rate, so we're roughly graduating 2/3 of our students on time. So there immediately we have the problem of the 1/3 who don't graduate on time. Some who graduate later, some who never do. But we have a second problem, which is of the 2/3 we graduate, only about 1/4 are college ready. And that's unacceptable, profoundly unacceptable. And that's not to miss for a moment that some very important and positive things have happened in the vein of education in this city over the last years. I'm someone who believes mayoral control was an important step forward. I think a lot of investments were made in the previous administration in which you served, and that was important. But I don't think we took some of the next steps in real time, and we're trying to do that now. Because the graduation rate, it's kind of one of the coins of the realm, and yet to me it's a bit of the wrong indicator, because it's when we're at the end of the process when in fact so much of the action is at the very beginning. My critique of American education writ large, humbly, is that to this day we're fighting for something that we already know, which is that we must invest in early childhood education. I don't know of, you are a true expert on public policy writ large. I don't think there's a lot of other areas where there's so much consensus on what works, on the multiplier effect it has, and on the fact that it would be a game changer for the whole equation, and yet it doesn't happen in most places. When I first proposed our plan for a full-day pre-K for every child in the city, I made a speech at the Association for Better New York, legendary business civic organization. I wanted to find something that I thought would be burnishing that we could say in terms of a great quote from someone who the audience would particularly appreciate. So I said to my team, go find a great quote. I thought they'd come back with something nice. They come back with Ben Bernanke, like the year before, saying that early childhood education was the highest yielding public investment possible. I was like, that's a damn good quote. So to congratulate the team. So, you know, I think when you look at the fact that we know children can learn at the ages of 3 and 4 in a way they cannot later, the foundation allows us to have a huge multiplier effect throughout, but it's also about early on showing children their potential and confirming to them the possibility they could make it. A young man one time, I was in the Bronx in a housing development We were giving out flyers door to door for a gun buyback program. And I come out the door to housing development, and a really, really large young man comes up to me. His name was Malik. We had a good conversation. He let me know very calmly, very respectfully, that he happened to be formerly incarcerated, and now he was working with young people. And he said, I think a lot of people don't understand that for a lot of our young people, the problem is at a certain point the message that they actually do not have hope or possibility, they actually aren't on a track anywhere, sinks in. And once you are convinced that you're not on a track anywhere good, well, why wouldn't a gang, for example, look like a good alternative? And so one of the things that pre-K does, among other things, after school and a lot of other things we're trying to do, is it says from the very beginning, you will make it. You're already starting to succeed. You're going to get to grade level. You're going to stay there. And so I'm not trying to be just vague or spiritual, if you will, about this. I'm trying to say that within all of the other things we're doing tangibly, we have to start to create a dynamic that says to our young people early on that they are on a successful path. That's why the investment in pre-K matters. That's why reinforcing that with after school, we've aimed our after school efforts at the middle school level, because that's a very make or break time, again, whether children will follow good influences or bad, and they need that reinforcement and tutoring and enrichment, et cetera. But I think the whole package of getting at the graduation issue is also about dealing with attendance early on, and we're trying to innovate ways to do that. It is about retaining our best teachers, who we've been losing in droves, and we have to do a better job of keeping. It's about parental involvement in a much deeper way than we've strategically achieved to date, because our efforts at parental involvement in education have been scattered. Many, many pieces that I think are all foundational, that are how we eventually move the ball, both on the graduation rate and on the level of ability that kids have coming out of school, so that when they graduate, it means more. Second, I'll go to higher education because I think it's a segue. So I would argue the biggest challenge is doing all those things to set up a path that people can actually get to higher education ready. We know right now in our city university, so many of our young people go there not ready, and then we have a whole remedial reality. My hope is with all of these changes and investments, we set a pathwork where that remedial reality is, not, if not a thing of the past, a rare dynamic. What I know is our tool in terms of higher education is the city university. And what I've suggested is that we're going to start to move away some of our, I think, less well-utilized funding for other types of economic development, other types of subsidy. We're going to progressively move that towards the city university. And the theory that a lot of young people who used to have easy access to it for years in this town simply can't afford it anymore. So we have to, it's partly about tuition and financial aid, but it's partly about also creating programs that are more pertinent to the current economy and incentivize young people to go because it actually has a job pathway included. One of the things I'm most enthusiastic about is creating a 2-year STEM program across the board in CUNY, because there are tech jobs right now. There are tech jobs people can get with the right high school education. There are tech jobs that certainly can be good jobs with a good futures that can be achieved with a 2-year degree. STEM degree, and I think that's the kind of thing we have to structurally catch up with, and that will also open a lot more opportunity for higher education. I'll finish with the charter piece. Look, I think from the very beginning, we said this all last year, and have tried to clarify it. I gave a speech nearby here at Riverside Church and tried to make clear my worldview of education sort of gets back to my worldview of society. All of the children, I don't care what part of the school system they go to, if they traditional public school, charter school, even religious school, they're all our future together. There's a lot we can do to support it. The pre-K and after-school efforts unite all those pieces. We want all of them in the game with us. I think it's clear, though, that the charter schools, when done right, really can be helpful innovators, but that has to be shared with the rest of the school system. That has not been happening consistently. When done right, the charter schools can be places that help us reach some kids who are hard to reach, and some of them do it brilliantly. Others have had a habit of not trying to be as inclusive of special ed kids or English language learners, and we have to resolve that, and I think we can. Charter schools, in some of the co-location battles we've had in this city about space, some of them have been good neighbors, some of them haven't. Some of the rules of engagement were fair, some of them weren't in terms of the existing schools. We've got to fix that, and we can, and we have a commission that's working on that now. But ultimately, I say it in the sort of simplest way. Right now in New York City, 94% of our public school kids, we have about 1.1 million public school kids, 94% are in traditional public schools. The entire future of New York City rests on them. So I'm going to work with all pieces of the equation, but the one I have to get right for our future is the traditional public schools. I think that does it then, yes? All right, well, I want to thank everyone for a chance to be with you.
Going to take a break for 5 minutes and then we'll reconvene with the panel.
to see you.
Could everybody please find their seats, and I'd like the panel to please come up to the podium. Thank you. And people could move up and fill in some of the holes in the seating. I wouldn't mind from the back to please move up. Welcome back, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our panel this afternoon, or morning, or whatever time it still is right now. I am really, truly delighted to introduce this panel this morning. We have 4 extraordinary New Yorkers with us, and we're going to focus on Mayor de Blasio's agenda as well as his speech. But each of these panelists have a special expertise and a special contribution that they've made to the city of New York. I'd like to just briefly introduce them, although you can find longer biographies in the program. In alphabetical order, Jennifer Jones Austin. Some of you are already very familiar with Jennifer because she was appointed by Mayor de Blasio to co-chair his transition committee, but that's really, I I don't want to say one of the least important things you've done so far in your life, but frankly, you've done some amazing things. I'm sure that's why the mayor put you in that position. Jennifer is currently the Chief Executive Officer for Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, which is really one of the premier social service agencies in the city of New York. She's also one of the architects of the mayor's Universal Pre-K plan. She served as Senior Vice President at United Way, and she also worked in government in a variety of positions, but was also the first Family Services Coordinator in the Bloomberg administration. I met her in that capacity. She is an extraordinary person. She's really devoted her entire life to public service, and I'm really thrilled you agreed to be on the panel this morning, Jennifer. Our second speaker will be Bruce Ratner. Well, it's really hard to talk about Bruce Ratner. Probably everybody in this room has an opinion about you, Bruce.
One way or the other.
One way or the other. Of course, I have the microphone, and I get to express my opinion. Everybody knows you're executive director, chairman, I'll get the title wrong, of Forest City Ratner Companies, and of course a co-owner of the Brooklyn Nets and the creator of the amazing Barclays Center. But you also need to know that Bruce is not just a developer, but he's a developer, I would say, in the public interest. He has the soul of a not-for-profit manager, even though he knows how to make money like a developer. And that's a very unusual combination, and all of his philanthropy and his public services really reflects his values, but it's also reflected in his buildings. And some of them are the most beautiful buildings in the city of New York now. One thing I really do want to highlight, Bruce Ratner built Metro Tech Center in Brooklyn before the hipsters decided to come to Brooklyn, before Brooklyn was hot. He invested in the future of the city of New York when other people were disinvesting, and for that I know all of New York thanks you. I also have to mention that he is a graduate of Columbia Law School. Who cares about your Harvard BA? Here we celebrate Columbia alum. So Jennifer, I'm sorry, I got to get you an honorary degree at Columbia. She is a Wagner School alum. Okay, I said it. Thank you, Bruce, for being with us this morning on the panel. Next is Richard Ravitch, another bold-faced name. Of course, he wouldn't like for me to say that, I know that. But I have to say it anyway, and Dick has really spent his life both going back and forth between the public and the private sector, but if we were looking for somebody that epitomizes the spirit of New York City and public service in New York, it's Dick Ravitch. As all of you know, he was one of the architects of the bailout of New York City in 1975 during our fiscal crisis. Without people like Dick, and I say specifically Dick, we wouldn't be able to experience the kind of renaissance that we're experiencing in New York City today. He was also the chair of the MTA when subway cars, looked like graffiti walls, and that wasn't even the problem. They didn't work, and business was threatening to leave New York City. And I truly believe that had Dick not been able to turn around mass transit in the city, again, we would not be where we are today. It's the lifeblood of the city. He's recently been lieutenant governor for Governor Patterson, and also he co-chaired the State Budget Crisis Task Force, which is his latest passion. And I hope you do go and help Detroit, because they really need you there, Dick. We all read in the Times that you were considering that. And finally, my colleague and good friend, Dorian Warren. Everybody should have a guy next door in the office next to them like Dorian. What can I say? He is not just the best academic neighbor, so if you have a very difficult problem you're working on, you can walk in and figure out the answer with somebody who is spectacularly smart, creative, and funny, which is very important in life, believe me, very important. Dorian's expertise is in the areas of public policy, African American politics, labor relations, and he's hails from Chicago and did his PhD at Yale. He edited a volume called Race and American Political Development, and he has a book coming out on Walmart, which I know we're all going to want to read. And you know, if you get bored on Sunday mornings, you can see him on MSNBC's Melissa Harris Perry show. I just had to give that a plug. So thank you all for joining us this morning. So we decided to proceed in a particular way because of the broad expertise in the room. I decided to frame questions for our panelists, so I hope everybody doesn't mind, and we will have some time for Q&A after the panel. So I thought we would begin with Jennifer Jones Austin. So as I mentioned before, Jennifer has extraordinary expertise in the area of social services and social policy, educational policy, and she's had a bird's eye view of this administration's policy agenda through her role in the Transition Committee, because all of us know that much of your policy has to be carried out by the people you appoint, and so this appointment process is critical in determining what kind of administration the de Blasio administration will be and what will be their priorities in the policy arena. So I'm wondering, Jennifer, if you could discuss both the challenges you see New York City has in maintaining its social safety net for the poor in this city, and how you think the administration should be spending its resources. We got a glimpse from the mayor already, obviously, about many of his priorities, and of course income inequality is at the top of this. But we have Jennifer here, and I'd love her to focus on some nitty-gritty policy questions on social policy.
Good morning, everyone. Let me begin by quickly thanking you, Esther, and Mayor Dinkins for giving me this opportunity to share my views. I also want to publicly thank Mayor Dinkins for providing me with critical support during the mayoral transition. He helped me to earn a PhD in New York City government in just under 4 months, and so I thank him for that. And I also, of course, always want to thank our new mayor, Mayor de Blasio, for giving me the gift that keeps on giving, the opportunity to serve, and to serve in meaningful ways. And lastly, I just need to apologize. I may have to leave at 11:30 if we're not done. I've got to go visit a sister college in New Jersey. I'll not give the name, just say it's a sister college to speak there at 1 o'clock, so forgive me. Over the course of my now 20-year career, I've had the opportunity to work with 2 mayors and 1 attorney general. And in each of them, I've witnessed a desire to protect some class of the vulnerable. With Mayor Giuliani, it was protecting children from abuse and neglect in reforming the child welfare system. Mayor Bloomberg has worked hard to address gun violence here in New York City, as well as bringing others along around the country. And Attorney General Eliot Spitzer worked very hard on issues of stop and frisk and predatory lending. What I've witnessed with Mayor de Blasio is that he has the desire to do all of that and more as soon as is humanly possible. His staff would say they are running faster than Carl Lewis did. He's leading in audacious ways, and what he's doing is what he talked about in his remarks. He's laying a foundation to do things that are bigger and better for the most vulnerable in New York City in ways that we haven't seen in a while. He's taking an uncharted path, and he's looking forward. He's leaning forward. You know, as Mayor Dinkins laid the foundation to address crime in New York City, Mayor de Blasio is doing so with income inequality. Universal pre-kindergarten, achieving the funding for full-day universal pre-kindergarten, something that was mandated by legislation 20 years ago, but never was fully funded. He's leading the way with that. Expanding middle school programs, after-school programs, especially for children who otherwise would not be able to receive them because their parents can afford them, because he appreciates that that is yet another step, another stone, if you will, in the framework for helping children to rise and move beyond their circumstances. As he talked about taking major steps to curtail stop and frisk and racial profiling, policies and practices which I believe, and many of us believe, have contributed to the demoralization of communities of color, dare I say the devastation of communities of color, and in particular, Latino and African American male youth. And of course, some work that I've helped to play a hand in, the build out of a citywide leadership team that shares his vision of a progressive government that is competent and diverse, and that's committed to overcoming, addressing, eradicating, doing away with income inequality. Turning to the questions presented, what are the challenges New York City has in maintaining its social safety net for the poor? And what should we be doing? What should the administration be doing with respect to spending its resources? Let me begin with the first. Maintaining the social safety net is challenging for several reasons, with the following two reasons being primary. One, the number of those in need of a social safety net has grown dramatically here in New York City. And two, the resources allocated for the social safety net has shrunk. As the Columbia Population Research Center found, nearly 4 in 10 New Yorkers suffered one or more severe material hardships in 2012. Facing those hardships meant they ended up staying in shelter overnight or moving in with others, and being unable to afford utilities, medical care, and food. In a city of wealth, 1.4 million people rely on food pantries and soup kitchens to eat. 1 in 5 children don't have enough food for their homes, in their homes. Over the past year, the number of people who are homeless, sleeping each night in the New York City shelter system, increased by more than 3,000 people to 53,615 in January 2014. That's the highest level ever recorded. The city now has about 140,000 more unemployed residents than it had 6 years ago before the Great Recession. And with job gains over the past few years concentrated in low-wage industries, many jobs that once could support a family barely suffice to keep that family from not living in poverty. More than 500,000 working families in New York City, 1 in 4, are considered low income. If that's not enough to challenge the safety net, a reduction in funds over the past several years to help meet the safety needs of people living on the lifeline at the brink of poverty certainly is. Cuts to human services in the last 3 years by New York State alone have totaled approximately $1 billion. Localities have cut as well. And adding to that, the federal sequester cuts, which totaled $42.7 billion nationally for non-defense programs, occurred just in 2013. New York State stands to lose up to $5 billion in federal funds over the next 9 years if the sequester cuts are not ended. Anticipated cuts to the federally funded food program, SNAP, were estimated to take 76 million meals off the table for New York City residents alone. Fortunately, the state recognized the gravity of the matter and restored some of the funding, not all of the funding, just some. Insufficient child care funding here in New York City has resulted in only 27% of eligible children receiving child care. And we've experienced $4 million in cuts to runaway and homeless youth programs, despite New York City having only 253 beds for 3,800 runaway homeless and youth. These are just some examples of how resources aren't meeting the need, how the safety net really isn't there for all who need it. How should the new administration be spending its resources? Maintaining the social safety net for the poor and working poor is certainly critical, but it's not enough. We often talk just about the social safety net. But the city has to also invest and reinvest in 3 key areas. Policies and programs that help individuals and families materially and sustainably improve and continually grow their income. Policies and programs that strengthen children and families. And policies and programs that strengthen communities. Concerning the first, we need policies and programs that truly help the poor and working poor access paths to upward mobility and prosperity. Many policies and programs have been put in place beginning since the war on poverty, programs like SNAP. By design, were not intended to help move people out of poverty and achieve upward mobility. They were intended to help them just kind of hold the line, keep them from falling further into poverty. These policies and practices, in some instances, have been effective in doing just that. And sometimes they've helped people get to the next step on the ladder. Sometimes people have used food stamps to help offset the cost of food and pay for tuition and other expenses that allow them to go on, earn a college education, and get to a higher level of income. But that's not the case for most. What we have to start doing is looking at policies and programs and looking at how they can help not just people in making ends meet, but also begin to change the circumstances by which people are living. Policies and programs that truly will help them achieve upward mobility. Looking at things like transitional jobs, not just a living wage, but a fair wage. Looking at child care tax credits, and doing something that FPWA and other organizations are working together to do right now. Looking at how, if you combine these types of policies that are focused not just on a social safety net, but upward mobility, what can you do longitudinally over time? See if we really are making a dent in helping people achieve upward mobility. Might we see increased wages over time if we do things like supporting college education tuition? Not just for 2-year programs, but for 4-year programs that put people on a path to upward mobility. Would that contribute to a sustainable reduction in poverty? The city must also invest in children and families. UPK is a sound investment, as is paid sick leave, but other investments must be made as well. You know, in China they have paid maternity leave. Why can't New York City? Paid maternity leave help single mothers keep their jobs. Shouldn't we be looking at things like that? And finally, we should be looking at policies and programs that strengthen communities, not just individuals. We can't believe the old line that if we save one child, all will be well and will make a difference. We've got to start supporting communities, empowering them, strengthening our schools, our hospitals, small businesses in the communities, helping people invest in home ownership, which is really how you build wealth and a way out of poverty. We have to start thinking about a city of equal opportunity as communities of equal opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is for Bruce Ratner. Now, as I mentioned in his introduction, we all know Bruce as the developer of Atlantic Yards. We also know that he's built probably anything that you could imagine that is built. He's managed to figure out how to build it. And he has a very important role to play. He is already playing it in creating affordable housing in New York City. I'm wondering, Bruce, if you could address the following question for our group here. The mayor has committed his administration to both expanding affordable housing for New Yorkers and also ensuring that the city remains a place that supports business growth and development. Are these compatible goals? I gave him the easy question, right? I gave Jennifer a fairly easy question too, right? She's going to resolve poverty for us. But truly, these issues are on the table now with the new administration, and we want to be as creative as possible. And given that we have 4 of the most creative people I know here, I want to press them in this direction. So are these compatible goals? Is there a right path in this kind of balance? And can you tell us from your own experience, too, how to move these two goals forward? So it's not really a trick question.
Thank you very much. First of all, I have to start where Jennifer started, which is thanking you, Esther, for inviting me, and thank you, Mayor Dinkins, who has been a mentor, believe it or not, to me since 1978. He used to pick me up when I worked for the city as Consumer Affairs Commissioner to go to something called the Firearms Control Commission, which involved long arms, and with the then police commissioner. So thank you for having me, and I love what you've done since you've been mayor. So the question. So I have to really start the question by answering that. The first thing, what is good for business generally? Because that is in some sense the most important thing. And I'm going to give you sort of a strange answer. The most important thing for business generally is for the city to be strong. So whether we're building affordable housing or middle income housing or market rate housing or building office buildings, the city has to be strong. But I take a strange view of what strong means. Strong doesn't mean everybody that's wealthy is getting wealthier. Strong means the kinds of things that the mayor talked about today, the kinds of things that Mayor Dinkins did. Whether it be security, number one, critical for a city, and I will get the affordable question. Security is absolutely critical for the business community. Education. You will find that most business people who are sort of forward-thinking are involved in education for a very good reason. We care about that. That's where employees come from. So education is very important for making a strong city. Minimum wage, this issue about the disparity in income in this city and in this country is, I think, the most serious issue today that faces us. And the quickest way to begin to do something about it is minimum wage. I'm someone who believes in a $15 minimum wage. I think that's necessary. That's good for the business community. It's very good for the business community. And I raise these issues because a lot of business people say, and it's the right question, is affordable, is this good for business or bad for business, and so on and so forth. Really for business, people who take a longer view of it, the kinds of things we're talking about, including affordable housing, are really important. They're important because a strong city is everything. And we got to get the affordable, just to sort of take off from what Jennifer discussed. You know that something like over 60% of the people in the city live or are what we would define as low income earners. And they live in housing that creates what's called a housing rent burden, meaning they pay more than 30% of their income to housing. Those are extraordinary figures, 60% of the city. So affordable housing is absolutely critical. We have to do something about it. I gave a talk in front of a group of real estate people, about 500 people, and I started by saying, big heart, we love New York City. And because we love New York City, we must fix the housing crisis. There is the worst crisis in housing that we have, I think, since the Second World War, since after the Second World War, when the veterans came back. The worst we've ever had. Our city is supposed to grow and become 9.2 million people by 2035. Now, some of that is net migration, which we're having for the first time over the last 3 years since the 50s. But a lot of it has to do with births coming into our city, and there has to be housing. There's almost not enough developable land in this city. There's a study done by this university in the entire city to accommodate the amount of housing that is needed just to create enough housing for the growth that's wanted. So it's such a crisis, and the affordable is the area where it's most needed. And I include, by the way, and the mayor does this too, by affordable, it doesn't mean only low income. It really goes up to even what we would call middle income. The greatest crisis isn't a low income, but it's getting worse. We have doubled our needs in the middle income community. We have doubled the rent burden problems over the last 10 years. So it's getting worse and worse. And I'm going to tell you that I firmly believe that it's going to get nothing but worse in terms of rents and the ability to afford living in this city over the next 10 or 15 years because the growth that's going on in this city, both as a result of births over deaths, the migration into the city as opposed to out of the city. So I really think, and I've said this to the real estate community, it is in a lot of ways, I don't want to say the single biggest because education, security, I want to put one very much above the other, but it is the most important thing. Now, on the other hand, so are jobs very important. What is a person without a job? What is a person without a job? A person without a job is a person who tends to spiral in life. So the amazing thing is the business community, if they're doing the right thing, they realize that there's a nexus between creating housing and creating jobs and doing something very important for the city, and I firmly believe that. So obviously, as you can tell by my politics, I think I've worked for the city for 7 years. I guess people would call me sort of progressive, at least compared to a lot of people in my business community. And so it is absolutely critical. Now why, and it's great for business. Why? Because it creates jobs building housing. So it's great for the business community. And the fact that we have the opportunity to continue to build and create, which I like to do, which we all like to do, is very good, and we like it. And this mayor has said, density is important. Why? Because we don't have enough room to build the housing. That's good for the business community, particularly the real estate community. So it's so compatible, because if anybody has any far-reaching thinking and has been in the city as long as I have, I started working for the city in the Mayor Lindsay's administration in 1970 in a Model Cities program, and then again in 78 for 4 years. So I've seen the city, and I've been involved in the city. I love this city, and there's nothing really more important than beginning to solve these problems. And the area that I'm in, which is in real estate and development, I only do development. I don't buy things. I do ground up. It's something I love to do, and I love to build. And with this mayor, there's an opportunity to continue building. It's harder to make the numbers work. It is true. But I want to tell you something really interesting. Business people are very clever if they're good, and they will figure out how to make affordable housing work. They will figure out how to make affordable housing work. I know they will. I know we will. Everyone will figure it out. They'll put this program with this program. They'll figure out how to build cheaper. And the unions are beginning to work with affordable housing. The unions, I think, understand that they have to be involved in affordable housing. Right now, they're not. I am someone who only builds union and will only build union. It's critically important. That's another thing. The business community has to understand that unions are very important. They created the middle class in this city and the country, and they will continue. So we cannot have $10 workers building buildings. We have to have $30 and $40 an hour workers doing buildings, and unions have done that. So I just want to say it is enormously compatible. We'll figure it out, because we like to make money, and we will figure it out, whether it's affordable, market, or middle. We'll figure it out. And this mayor is giving us the opportunity to do that. And I know that when we hear next week what the housing program, if we think in any far-reaching way or any progressive way, we will see that it's something that's very, very good for the business community. You will hear people complain. Having worked for the city, and I work with consumer affairs commissioners, so for one period of time I heard nothing but complaints. So I know what it is to complain. And you know, there's always another side to every story. So I want to tell you, from this person's business community, and I preach this in front of business communities. If I'm in front of revenue, I talk about minimum wage, I talk about unions, I talk about affordable housing, and that has to continue to be done. I can tell you, we shouldn't start giving up on any of those kinds of things. And if we do that, we will have a strong city. If we have a strong city, it is very, very good for the business community and for creating jobs. So,
thank you. My next question is for Dick Ravitch. Dick, what I was really going to ask you was how your experience at Columbia College taking the core curriculum impacted your career, but you know, and if you want to answer that too, you might answer that also. But I thought that I'd jump a little fast forward and have you talk to us really about fiscal issues that are confronting the city. I mentioned your experience, of course, in the 1975 fiscal crisis and your restructuring of the New York State MTA. But recently you've been also doing an extraordinary amount of work looking at state and local fiscal issues. Could you evaluate the challenges Mayor de Blasio is facing at the outset of his administration, and what you think he specifically should be focusing on, and where are some of the hard choices? Because fiscal policy always demands hard choices, whether people like it or not. We never really do have enough money to do the things everybody wants to do. And of course, if you could talk a little bit about the state and federal government's role in this, or lack of role, we would also appreciate that. So that's a little easy question for you, Dick.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I've never said no to an invitation that has anything to do with David Dinkins in the world, because he's a spectacular human being and a good friend. He was kind enough to mention my book, and I want to answer your question about Columbia, because I give a great deal of credit for my convictions about wanting to make the world better and understanding how democracy works to an extraordinary education here. And people like Lionel Trilling and Richard Hofstadter and David Truman, and you're all too young to remember who they were, but they were the giants in academia here. They really taught me what makes democracy work and to believe in politics, to understand that the only way to change anything in a democracy is by being involved in politics. And I tried it once, but David Dinkins whipped my you-know-what. But it didn't discourage me from encouraging every young person who cares about making the world a better place to recognize that either you run for office or you get involved with somebody who does, and that's the only way we're going to change anything. Now, we got a hell of a lot to change because of all these wonderful aspirations that I heard about from Bill de Blasio and Jennifer and Bruce are not achievable under our current system of federal, state subsidy and tax system. The money isn't there. So what are the challenges that the mayor faces? First of all, he's required by law to submit a budget, actually to submit a first draft by the end of this month. I'm not sure, without having yet negotiated with the labor unions or settled those negotiations, that he's going to be capable of putting a full-blown plan forward. But it's critical that he do so in time for the council to review it and the public to review it at the end of the fiscal year, which is June 30th. So his first challenge is, having been left the enormous blessing of no outstanding collective bargaining agreement by the previous mayor, with an enormous number of facts and costs associated with that uncertainty having been pushed forward to Bill de Blasio. That's his first and very large challenge. And until he's able to negotiate a fair deal for the public employees and one that makes sense within the context of the available resources for the city of New York, he's not going to have the flexibility or even know how much financial flexibility he's going to have to do all of the things that Jennifer described quite accurately that are fundamental needs to make this city a more just place. And I don't like to sound as if I'm Cassandra, because the truth is I really believe that we will ultimately solve this problem. We've overcome much more serious problems in this country. We won a world war. We ended 150 years of racial segregation. We beat the Soviets in a tough competitive game. We'll overcome this problem, but at the moment there is an enormous gap in our politics, which, as I said, is how you change things, between a willingness to pay to keep all the promises that we made and to meet all the values that I think this society ultimately and profoundly believes in. And there is a conflict. And as long as people in politics think that lowering taxes is a better way of achieving popularity than raising them, you can forget about all those bold dreams because the money ain't there to change anything. And that is the hard fact. Now, I'm not saying one should be insensitive to the impact of taxes. You have to measure very carefully the impact on the economy, how and where you allocate a tax burden. And that is very much part of the challenge that the mayor is going to have. But let me tell you why that challenge is even more difficult than is generally understood. There was reference to, Jennifer talked about federal cuts. It is hard to imagine, given the political complexion of Washington, that that is going to be reversed in the foreseeable future. And I want to point out to you that states in this country get about 30% of the money they spend out of the discretionary federal budget, which is $650 billion. And if that's cut 10%, you're talking about a cut to New York State that is overwhelmingly significant in the discretionary part of the state's budget. And then the cities in this country get about the same percentage of their expenditures from states. So fiscal stress rolls downhill. States are spending an increasing amount of money competing with one another for business. Nobody's raising a question about whether or not, in fact, if all those business subsidies would indeed, if they were gone, where would people go? I gave a speech one day and somebody stood up and said, Mr. Ravitch, you're really implying that we ought to pay more taxes. If we have to pay more taxes, we're all going to move to Las Vegas. And I said, well, that may be a good thing, because then if everybody moves to Las Vegas, then they'll have to build a subway system, and we'll have 2 more senators who'll vote for mass transit aid. But kidding aside, we have to be much more honest about that. We have legacy costs that in and of themselves we can't afford. Our pension systems in New York are significantly underfunded. And the calculation of the actuarially required contribution is based on the payrolls that existed when the last set of contracts were entered into. They don't even reflect the step increases that have occurred in the interim. And they are significantly underfunded. Number 2, though healthcare costs have leveled off recently, most economists believe that they're going to start to rise again very, very significantly. A third or over a third of New York State's budget is Medicaid expenditures. In 3 years, when and it now looks as if Obama health care is here to stay, thank God. But it under its own terms, 3 years from now, the federal reimbursement rate of the incremental cost for all the people who are covered as a result of ACA drops from 90% to 50% by law. And unless the Congress changes that, and the present complexion of the Congress, it will not change, then you're going to find an enormous liability hitting the state and the city in 3 years. Number 3, the physical infrastructure is in the level of disinvestment is recognized by every professional in the field. You cannot maintain the capital integrity of our subway system, of our schools, of our public facilities without spending money. And you can't acquire that money, which you're entitled to do by capital borrowing, unless you have revenues that will service that. And we need a plan at a state level and a federal level to provide that. Why the political climate is so negative about the necessity of that, I'm reminded of a marvelous story. And in 1979, Jimmy Carter proposed a 3-cent increase in the gas tax, and it never got out of Congress. I was chairman of the MTA at the time, and 1981, Ronald Reagan proposed a 4-cent increase in the gas tax, 1 penny of which was to go to mass transit, and was the largest infusion of federal money into public transportation ever. And as chairman of the MTA, I was invited to the White House for the bill signing, and a reporter said, Mr. President, how could you possibly have supported an increase in the gas tax when you got elected on a platform of no new taxes? President Reagan looked at that reporter and said, "It's not a tax, it's a user charge." Well, I never voted for Ronald Reagan, but I sure wish we had some politicians today who understood you could characterize things in a lot of different ways. Last of all, let me say this. We have a society, and again, Jennifer's recitation of the statistics is absolutely staggering. I mean, nationwide, we have almost 60 million people on food stamps. We have the constant assertion that raising taxes will depress economic activity. But there is no overwhelming evidence that that has ever been the case. New York has enjoyed its greatest prosperity during a period in which the actual marginal tax rate was higher. And look, I'm a bloody capitalist. I don't like to pay taxes. But taxes never diminished the greed of anybody I knew. And I'm sure that goes for you too, Bruce. And we have to be honest with ourselves about this. I don't mean to make light of it. It is a very tough choice, and it's got to be talked about. There was no debate in the legislature of the state of New York 3 weeks ago when they passed a budget that reduced taxes. There was no debate about it. I'm not saying it was the wrong decision. I don't happen to agree with it, but it's a perfectly legitimate conclusion. But there was not any debate whatsoever. So I think that what the mayor is going to do and going to be able to do is to make sure that there is a constructive dialogue in politics, not in academia, not in the street, not at the institutions that Jennifer is responsible for, but in politics, to recognize that we have very, very competing needs. We have to maintain a private economy if there are going to be any revenues to tax, but we also have obligations that we incurred, whether to public employees, to health care for the poor and the elderly. The cumulative impact of those obligations, many of which are contractual, many of which are constitutionally protected, is in jeopardy in many, many places. And so you're going to see this is going to be the central domestic issue for the United States of America. And for the mayor of the city of New York, which is our largest city and our most central city in our cultural and political terms, he's got to play a role nationally being a spokesman, because there isn't any part of this country that doesn't face exactly the same challenges that he does.
Thank you, Dick. Before we move on to our last panelist's introductory comments, I would be remiss as a person who was formerly in government not to acknowledge a sitting commissioner who's here with us today, Emily Lloyd, who was recently returned back into government service to be the Department of Environmental Protection Commissioner, is here. And how brilliant of Mayor de Blasio to bring you back, that's all I can say. And we also have the former mayor of Kansas City with us, Mark Funkhauser, and I wanted to introduce him too. So they have some they had some problems in Kansas City, but I know you fixed them all. So you're going to help us here in New York. He's currently the publisher of Governing Magazine as well. So for our final panelist, I want to ask Dorian a set of even more difficult questions than I've asked the other panelists. He's got a very broad experience studying and also engaging in urban policy. But his primary areas of interest are labor and race and income inequality, which seem to be areas that our current mayor also finds interesting and appropriate for a public policy discussion in the city. So Dorian, could you talk to us a little bit about what you think the issues facing the black community in New York City are, and what kinds of policies are particularly important? And is income inequality the right focus for this discussion? And of course, please bring in anything about labor that you want to tell us.
Thank you, Esther, for that very light question. Thank you, Mayor Dinkins, and thank you, Esther, for being our leaders, for organizing this event. The best thing that could have happened to a kid from Chicago moving to New York was to get seated next to the offices of Esther Fuchs and Mayor Dinkins. So I've learned a lot these last few years. And let me start, Esther, with the labor issue in terms of the labor contracts, and then I'll move to the black community. And that is, I think, one of the greatest challenges, as Mr. Ravitch just pointed out, that Mayor de Blasio faces right now. Having said that, if I don't believe in the invisible hand of the market, but if there is an invisible hand, I think it's Basil Patterson's right now who will help to guide these negotiations, because there is a different tone. So there are 300,000 city workers, $9 billion on the table is what they're asking for in back pay, yet the mayor has already struck, Mayor de Blasio has struck a very different tone in terms of the negotiations. There's been some progress made in terms of the teachers, which, if they can come to an agreement, will set what we call pattern bargaining. It'll set the pattern for the rest of the city workers. But there is going to have to be compromise, frankly. The city cannot afford all that the unions are asking for. And secondly, there's a challenge of the unions themselves not being united on what they're asking for in terms of all the municipal unions. So those are challenges that the mayor will have to figure out across the 152 bargaining units in the city. But I think the spirit of negotiations is very optimistic. On the question of the issues facing the black community, and is income inequality the right focus, I think it is. And I'll have some caveats at the end, but Mayor de Blasio talked about this earlier, so I want to put it in a little bit of context in terms of the black community. Two major issues, not just affecting the black community in New York City, but across the country, are unemployment and low-wage work. So high rates of unemployment in black communities across the country, in some cities actually at Depression-era levels. And then secondly, where black workers can find work, the vast majority are working in low-wage jobs. So in this city, by one estimate, roughly half of black workers work in low-wage jobs, meaning you can work full-time and still be under the official national poverty rate, not to mention that poverty rate is very conservative considering the cost of living in New York City. So what's the overall context? I think the mayor's focus on inequality is right. We talk a lot recently about the 1%. There's something called Occupy Wall Street a few years ago that started this debate in the public realm, but long before it became a public debate, there was an academic debate about the role of inequality in the 1%. And you might have read there's a new economist rock star that was in New York City last week, Thomas Piketty, with this book about capital in the 21st century, highlighting these trends. I just want to point out, it's his data actually that has forced the conversation on the 1%. And so what we know from his data is that the top 1% takes home roughly 20 to 25% of national income. You should know in New York City in 2012, the top 1% here took home close to 40% of the city's income. So the disparity is wide, and it's even greater when we add race to that. So I think it was a risky bet for Mayor de Blasio to campaign on this, to be honest, and I think it paid off handsomely. It has changed the paradigm for both the Democratic Party and mayors across the country who are now emboldened, I think, to campaign on this. And thankfully, all eyes are on New York City and not Los Angeles or other places, or even my hometown of Chicago, in terms of this question of income inequality. So what are the challenges facing the mayor? He wants, for instance, a citywide minimum wage. I'm glad to hear Mr. Ratner say $15 an hour. That's a very radical thing to say. You're going to get in lots of trouble. Thank you. Unfortunately, Seattle and San Francisco might beat us to the punch. They're currently debating also a $15 an hour citywide minimum wage. Here's the challenge for Mayor de Blasio and his administration. There's something called Dillon's Rule, and this is a Supreme Court precedent that says that states give authority to cities, or to say it another way, cities are creatures of state governments. So the city of New York currently does not have the authority to pass a citywide minimum wage. Does not have the authority. That, I think, is the biggest challenge. The mayor knows this. Others know this. So challenge number one is figuring out a strategy in Albany and with Governor Cuomo to allow cities in the state of New York to have that home rule authority, at least around raising wages. That's the big challenge. If that challenge is overcome, a $15 an hour minimum wage in the city of New York, I think, is a piece of cake. That's the big challenge, is getting the authority for that to happen. I just want to also highlight something the mayor said in his remarks, and he was referring to Mayor LaGuardia taking cues from FDR and then making them real in New York City. And what's great about this moment for all of us is we have a mayor who's not taking cues from the president. He is leading the president on this question. And in that sense, he's part of what cities, broadly speaking, New York City is the leader. Cities are the places of innovation around inequality, both income and racial inequality, not states and not the federal government right now. So I think this is a moment we should step into and not let it pass us by. So in terms of the black community, the mayor also mentioned wanting to retrofit buildings. So that gets at the first problem I mentioned of unemployment. So job creation is crucial, as well as job quality. It's one thing to create jobs, but if they're all minimum wage, low wage jobs, we're not going to address the vast income disparities and racial gaps in pay. And I think one tool the mayor has is something that Ester, Professor Fuchs, and Kim Bayer, who's in the audience, and I recently wrote, and that's a report on how to increase the numbers of minority youth in the building and construction trades in this city. So without some kind of programs of getting people, and especially black and Latino youth, into these new jobs the mayor wants to create, that will not address the disparities in the black community when it comes to work. Secondly, or thirdly, their income inequality is one thing, and I think the focus is right on income inequality, but it doesn't mean when you address income inequality, you address racial inequality automatically. So yes, some of the racial disparities will close if we can lift wages, but there are some racially specific issues. So think stop and frisk, which the mayor has ended, thankfully, and we should be very happy about that as someone that's been stopped and frisked several times. But also this question of residential segregation, which I think is also linked to the affordable housing question, which disproportionately affects black communities in this city. We need some innovative city strategies, whether it's community benefit agreements that Mr. Ratner has signed before with developments, guaranteeing the community certain benefits of new developments, including affordable housing, including living wage jobs. But we also have to be more creative, and I don't think any of us have the answers just yet on the question of residential segregation by both race and class, frankly, which has, in New York City, places like my hometown Chicago, are intractable seeming problems that we have to really put the best minds together to figure out. So I would say in conclusion, Esther, income inequality, the policies addressing income inequality will go part of the way to addressing the problems of the black community, but we also need some racially specific policies, especially around policing, public safety, and residential segregation to complement those policies.
Thank you. I want to give our panel one last chance to make comments before I open it up for questions. Everybody in this room has either served in government in some capacity or has worked with government, and we all know that mayors have a lot on their plate, and most of it's taken up with some basic policy issues that they have to deal on a day-to-day basis with, like criminal justice policy and economic development policy. And this mayor has articulated a very, very broad agenda, and not to mention having to deal with the crisis of the day. So if you were guiding him, and many of you are, which is why I'm asking this question, could you be specific about where he should be focusing this little bit of reservoir energy that he has personally using his leadership? I mean, he's done UPK, and that's out there, and he'll still be working on that. So that let's put that on the table and not use that as an example. But where would you suggest he uses this reservoir of leadership capacity and his bully pulpit and platform, and also the resources of the city, to focus on this broad agenda that he's outlined for us and that you've all have helped us understand? So I'm going to ask Jennifer to start because she has to leave soon, and then we'll follow through on the rest of the panel.
So, very simple. I believe that the mayor needs to do more to engage with the business community, to bring the business community into this conversation in more deliberate, thoughtful, and planful ways. We can't do this alone as a social services community, as we all appreciate. And so I think it's very important that business leaders be around the table together with human service leaders, other stakeholders, all of the sectors in the city, to figure out how we move forward collectively.
Bruce?
Well, I certainly agree with you, Jennifer. On the other hand, I will say that business eventually comes around. We just do. Eventually we come around. The mayor is the mayor. And everyone eventually realizes that, and that there's enormous strength there, and that whether we like it or not, we must do business with this city. So I'm less worried really about that. I do think that what the mayor has done, and I think advertently, is focus on very big issues, really pushed them and been very persistent about them. Because if you think about leadership, leadership is a lot about keeping your eye on the ball, not having 40 big issues, having a few very important, meaningful issues, being persistent about pushing them. And obviously, you have, all of a sudden my lettering comes off, but universal pre-K is something he focused on, he got everyone to believe in, and he did it. Now, housing's coming up next week, and I think that's going to be a very innovative program. It's very hard to solve that. You asked me a question, I didn't answer it completely because it is very hard to solve. But he's going to focus on that, I think, in the same way that he did pre-UK, which is very, very important. He's going to focus on that issue until he really gets somewhere. And so I think this idea of focusing on very, very big issues, coming up with major policy proposals after talking to the business community, which has happened, and really pushing them is the way to go. These big issue, much really, when you think about what Mayor Dinkins did with on the crime issue, and I remember it so well. You cannot imagine how important that issue was at the time for those of us who lived through it, including the business community. Every single business meeting I go to, the business group would say, we can't stay in this city. The crime is too bad. We focused on it, pushed it, talked about it, met with the business community, and got it done. And so I think what he is doing, this idea of focusing on a few big issues that are really, really important, including, I think, eventually minimum wage will be in the same category. And I agree with Dorian, it's critical. So by picking 4 or 5 very big impact, big bang for your buck issues and focusing on them and taking leadership. And leadership to me is about persistence as much as anything. And he's obviously very good at that. So that's what I think. I think continue what you're doing on focusing on big issues, be persistent, get everybody around them, and really be convincing. So.
Thank you. Dick.
Well, I hate to disagree, but I think it is a little fatuous to talk as if there is something called a business community. The Koch brothers had nothing in common with George Soros, and they are both business people in New York City. The business community is totally diverse. The real estate industry has a very understandable set of interests. They're concerned about the real estate tax going up. They'd rather see an income tax increase that applies to everyone than a big increase in the real estate tax in New York City. Business people are like everybody else. Some are liberals, some are conservative, some are interested in politics, some aren't. So there's no such thing as, there are organizations like the Partnership, and to some politicians that carries a great deal of weight, but to suggest that the business community is monolithic and therefore has to be negotiated with is, to me, not the way the system works. That's number one. Number two, that is equally true for the labor world. The interests of the public employee unions are at increasing variance with the interest of many of the other unions because of the increasing cost of benefits that public employees get that are not available to members of private unions. So the labor movement is no longer as if it ever was totally monolithic, but they did have common goals, and now they're quite at variance in many, many places around this country, including New York. And anybody who tells you contrary-wise is naive. Third of all, what the mayor of the city of New York has to do, in my judgment, is he's got to force. You're not going to get the state to give up, to delegate power to impose taxes. With all respect, it may be a nice thing in the abstract, but it's a silly thing to expect might happen or to waste any energy on. What you have to do is the mayor has got to go into every election of any member of the New York State Legislature and say, look, if we don't get the revenue we need to begin to address the problems in the city of New York, I want to campaign against you in the next election. And if he's not willing, to use his political popularity to effect a change in the political complex of the state legislature, then he's not going to achieve anything.
Dorian.
So the mayor has a lot of agency. He can do a lot of things. He's laid out a vision, a strategy. He's implementing it. But I actually think we need to understand the limits of any one person, and in particular the mayor. He resides in a context, in a set of institutions with constraints, and therefore I actually think it's incumbent on his supporters, individuals, but especially community organizations, unions, other progressive organizations, to be pushing and creating the space for him to enact his agenda. If we didn't learn anything from the first term of the Obama administration, it was this. We all got Obama elected, and then we all went home as if he had a magic wand and could just do whatever he wanted to do with Congress. That is not the case with any president, with any mayor, and so I think it's actually incumbent on the city's progressive forces to create the environment for the mayor to succeed. And if we expect the mayor to do it on his own, we will ultimately be disappointed, I guarantee you.
Thank you. We have time for some questions. There are 2 mics. If you could just get up and stand in front of the mic, I can call on you. We're going to take the questions and we'll take the questions two at a time. Why don't you start? Identify yourself, please, and I really beg everybody to ask a question as opposed to make a long statement, since we don't have a lot of time.
Hi, I'm Eric Alterman. Seems to me what we're discussing is how to implement an urban liberal agenda. And in doing so, given all the constraints, and in doing so, I want to take issue with something Professor Warren said and ask the panel to comment on it. It's my view that if you have a mayor who's committed to addressing inequality, economic inequality, that's great. Economic inequality is an enormous problem with an incredible amount of tentacles that reach into our lives in so many ways. If you start talking about addressing racial aspects of it, then you're dividing people. Then you're giving something to one community that you're not giving to another. You're making other communities jealous. You're saying it's us versus them. It may be necessary, it may be a good thing, but if you talk about it in class terms rather than in ethnic terms, then you're rising all boats, and the very same people who you're trying to help are going to get helped in ways that won't create the divisions that have, in my view, destroyed urban liberalism for the past 30 yeyears, or certainly weakened it.
That's actually an interesting question. And
that's Eric Alterman from The Nation magazine. We've been debating this for 40 years, right? Race versus class, identity politics versus class politics. We're not going to solve it here. But what I will say is it's one thing in terms of the policies that we need to address all forms of inequality. It's another thing in terms of how you frame it and talk about it. So we might have a quibble in terms of the framing, But I still think assuming that class-based policies will solve racial disparities is naive as best. The evidence that doesn't support it. And so, you know, a policy like stop and frisk, the city was already divided. So ending the policy, if anything, is going to help to unify the city, not further divide it.
Okay. Does anybody else want to comment on that? I think we're good.
Janow, I'm Teachers College alumni. My question is for Professor Warren. You spoke about a publication that is out with youth and construction and employment. In the late 90s, early 2000s, I served on the board called the Youth Action Program and Home. And these students that we worked with, they build homes for the homeless, and they got a GED. When they left the program after 1 year, they would have a GED and a skill in the construction industry. We ran into all kinds of problems trying to place them in those positions where they had skills because we ran into unions, the electricians, the plumbing, whatever. Did you address it in your book, and how can I get it? I would really like to read it.
Esther, you want to...
It's actually online on the SIPA website, so if you go onto the SIPA website, the paper's available there. Otherwise, give us your card and we'll send you the link.
And the answer is
Thank
yes.
you.
Yes, unions are a big, let me say, in New York and most other cities, the building and construction trade unions have, yes, been historically exclusionary. We are at a different moment because they're facing different kinds of challenges. And so what we document in the report is a program that successfully places Black and minority high school graduates into apprenticeship programs, pre-apprenticeship programs. They stick through them, it's fully funded, and the data speaks for itself.
Thank you very much.
I think Bruce will address that as well.
One comment is that things have changed a lot in the city in lots of ways, so a couple important facts, and then I'm going to hit you with a fact that's frankly shocking. About 60 to 70% of the housing that's built in the city is not union currently. So it is fairly open in terms of who works. Second, for example, in building our arena, approximately 41% of the workers were of color. But if 1 to 2% of the workers are women only in our construction trades. And that honestly is the single biggest problem, because most of your single parent families are women. And they're the leaders of most of the families in our city. And so that is an area that has to be improved, has to be worked on more than any single thing. And that goes for union and non-union. That's not only a union issue, because you look at the non-union trades, you've got the same issue. And it's remarkable. Who ever heard of anything? 1 to 2% women. So it's, I think, in the construction area and in terms of the city and inequality of wages between men and women, in terms of who leads our families in most of our city, that to me is about as big a problem in the construction area as I can imagine. Our company works hard in that area, and honestly, we're probably the leaders, and I honestly can't tell you, it's probably more than push is probably not more than 2 or 3%. Probably 2 and 3 times what it is for others. But so.
Let's take the next question, please, and then we're going to ask Dr. Roscoe Brown and Dr. Redlener to ask their questions.
My name is Pietro Porcella. I'm a journalist and a teacher. And last month I was invited by the Italian consulate for a meeting regarding giving the schools, the public school, a bilingual status with the help of the City of New York and the DOE. And they indicated Russian, Chinese, Italian, French, and Spanish, which is still already happening, some Spanish school. Like all the school in New York will be a public school having a bilingual study. I want to know from the panel if you know the City of New York, at what status we are on that.
That's an interesting question, but I think since the mayor isn't here, we're going to have to forward that question to him. So get back to me afterwards, okay? Dr. Redlener and then Dr. Brown.
Thanks, and it's an extraordinarily informative panel. Thank you. I'm Erwin Redlener, and I'm at the Earth Institute, where I run the National Center for Disaster Preparedness and a new program on child well-being and resilience. The question I have, though, is really about mayoral priorities. And I'm of several minds here, and I agree very much with what Bruce said about the need to focus on very specific things, big things that could be accomplished. On the other hand, the reality is that so many of these issues are interlocking. How we deal with the job creation and people being ready for jobs, how we actually improve schools, and how that is related to the health of school children are all absolutely inseparable. So when you're at that position as the president of the country or the mayor of a big city like New York, in some ways you don't actually have the luxury of saying this, not that. And just the fact I want to mention here is this issue of the relationship, for example, of health status of children and learning. So now we have a situation where many of the low-performing schools in New York at third grade level will have 80 to 85% of the children not performing at third grade level. Some of those children are not performing because they have unrecognized and undertreated or non-treated medical problems. They have asthma, which hasn't been diagnosed. They're up all night coughing. They fall asleep in the classroom. They're determined to have visual problems at the beginning of the school year. They're not followed up with. I spoke to a kid a month and a half ago, a fourth grader who wants to be a veterinarian, and it took her 6 months to get glasses. She basically lost half of the school year at a very critical moment. So this issue of how do you make sure you're not focusing on particular issues, because they're dramatic, at the expense of other issues which are absolutely critical to also understand and play out as we're planning for what needs to happen in a city like New York.
Why don't we all, who wants it, you want to start, Bruce?
Well, so you're right about everything you've said, and if you take an area I'm more familiar with, not as familiar in the education area, affordable housing. So next week the mayor's going to announce his affordable housing program. But think about that. Within that, there's a lot of possibilities. You could say, for example, we're going to do affordable housing, but at the main, and we're also, as part of that, we want to train new workers so that every time when something is built, it's got to begin to have, instead of 1%, 3 or 4% women workers, 5%. So every time you do something, and I'm sure it's just in the education area, same thing. When you're building affordable housing, yes, but we want 20% of the workers to be newly trained workers. So there's an opportunity every time you do something big to add on additional issues that are very, very important to the city. Again, I don't know the education area, but I can say in the development area, there's tremendous opportunities for training, for education, for changes this mix of whether it's getting more people of color, or women, or younger people, or high school graduates, or high school dropouts to work, as well as who you in fact put in the residentials, who manages it, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of issues that I think can be done around it. But you are right. You need to always. There are so many issues, but you need to try and tie them together when you can. And I think with creativity, it can be done in a lot of different ways. So that would be what I would say.
I'd just like to make the observation that it's about 30% unemployment in the building trades in the city of New York today. You could talk about training people and creating jobs, but if there isn't revenue to finance capital expenditures, it's kind of a pointless exercise.
So Richard leaned over. I have to say that Richard leaned over to me. I'm sorry. Said, "I'm sorry."
I'm going to ask Dr. Brown to ask us the last question.
Could I just make one comment?
Yes,
one
Bruce,
correction,
sure.
because Richard said something which was, you said, sorry to disagree with you. Right now, we almost have no jobs available in the construction trades. There's almost full employment right now. It's changed that dramatically in the last 6 months. Basically, the unions we're doing something, we cannot get workers. So what's happened actually in the last 6 months is it's reversed itself.
Okay, well, I have to make a suggestion myself. Dorian and I, as we mentioned, wrote a study on minority youth employment in the construction trades, and we have this extraordinary program in New York, Construction Skills, which funnels minority youth into the unions and into the construction trades, and they stay and they have middle-class jobs. So we would like to see the mayor, as in Mayor de Blasio, convene a summit of all the appropriate stakeholders and get this done. Start getting these kids into these middle-class jobs. They're ready. They're in our New York City public high schools, and we've got the program in this city to make it happen. Dr. Brown.
During one of the previous administrations, I was chairman of the New York City Employment and Training Planning Council, And one of the purposes there was to figure out how we could train the workforce for the economy of today. Right now, I think we have a skills gap in New York City, and one suggestion that I would like to have considered is to require every corporation to put up a certain amount of money for internships and training programs, maybe 2%, 3%, whatever. What is your reaction to that?
Why don't we go down, start with Dorian and work our way down?
Dr. Brown, I do know of one program that is a great model for that called Year Up. And it is a fantastic program. It was featured on 60 Minutes a few weeks ago, based here in New York City. Major corporations have put money in to training many high school dropouts or people with GEDs, getting them into classes, paying for it, getting them into internships, and then a commitment to hiring a certain percentage of those folks after the internship. So we do have the model out there, and I think if we could expand it with more participation from many of our big businesses here in the city, I think that'd be fantastic.
I'd like to close the forum on a student question. So we'll ask our last question. Identify yourself, please, and then Mayor Dinkins will come up and close the forum.
Hi, I'm Casey Cooklick. I'm a second-year student at SIPA. I had the privilege of taking Ester's class last year, and one of the major things we talk about...
He already got his A. How do you like that? And he still said something nice.
One of the major things we talked about was politics and how it informs public policy, and I want to bring us back to politics in the sense that the new administration sort of signals a shift which is necessary both politically and sort of aesthetically from the previous 12 years. And we've sort of been talking about this administration in a vacuum, which I think ignores the 12 years that have, under Bloomberg, in which a lot of work, good work was done, and bad. So I'm thinking...
I did not plant that question. I just want everybody to know. Okay.
But I'm thinking specifically of Plan NYC, but I'm open to hearing your thoughts on which policies that this new administration might build off of rather than just sort of signaling a total course correction or shift.
That is actually a great question. Why don't we start with Dorian and work our way back and let everybody take a crack at that?
I'm gonna defer to the expert in the room on this, and that's Professor Fuchs. The one thing I'll say is, in terms of addressing poverty, I think what Mayor de Blasio should do is an evaluation of the previous administration's effort to address poverty and understand, especially around conditional cash transfers, some of the other programs, what worked and what didn't work, and what could he extend and what should he redirect. So just on the issue of poverty and inequality, you're right, there is a precedence there carried over from the previous administration that we should learn from, the lessons good and bad from.
I have a rather bizarre observation about this. It's my view that in our democratic system, there really aren't policies, they're programs. And programs are addressed to political exigencies, human exigencies at any given moment in time. So I think that there were a lot of things that were done in the Bloomberg administration that were terrific. Some are debatable. The reasons why the number of homeless people increased as dramatically as it did in the last few years, that's a function of a city policy, maybe to some extent decisions by the state as well. But, everything builds on what happened beforehand. I mean, we're still relying on the same statutory framework to provide the means to create below-market housing in our system, tax abatements, tax-exempt financings. There are no new tools available to do that. Actually, the federal cutbacks on the Section 8 voucher program have had a devastating impact on our ability to provide affordable housing for the poor in this city. But, I understand the question, but, a lot of talk about education, yet the percentage of kids who graduated from high school's system has not changed one iota in the last 12 years. Whether other changes in the educational system were good or not is a very subjective question, but that's not a policy. Those were a series of specific programmatic exercises. Once you got past the question of whether there should be a Board of Education or a mayoral control, and I agree with the mayor and with Mayor Bloomberg that mayoral control was precisely the thing. But I'm not sure, for example, that in and of itself is going to produce any measurable impact in the quality of our educational system. And I think, again, Bill de Blasio understands it very well. Unless you have a meaningful early childhood education program, and unless you focus your energy and your resources on the children who grow up in poverty, who are generally the ones who can't compete adequately and constitute an almost infinitesimal percentage of the children in charter schools, unless you focus where the real need is, you're not going to change anything about education.
Bruce?
Actually, I think if you think about it, this new administration is actually building on the major things that were done in the Bloomberg administration. That may sound a bit strange, but it's really true. You take three main areas we've talked about today: education, security, and housing. They're all built on things that were done in the Bloomberg administration. Take housing. In his administration, 160,000 housing units were built. A substantial amount were low income. Substantial amount were low income. Education, wresting control of education, making it mayoral. Obviously, built on Bloomberg. The focus on education, whether you agree or disagree exactly what was done, it's the focus on it, making it. It was not, by the way, the focus prior to Bloomberg. It was a lot of other issues, crime and so on. Bloomberg is the one who focused us on education. And if you take the last area, which is crime, there's no question, as this mayor has said, the last mayor brought crime down to 350 homicides a year, down from 2,000 some many years ago. And this mayor is bringing it down even more. The appointments are very, very many from previous administrations, whether it was Dinkins administration, Koch, Giuliani, heavily from the Bloomberg administration. And obviously the appointment of the police commissioner follows in a tradition of Kelly in many ways, obviously separates from Kelly in many ways in terms of stop and frisk and so on. So I think if you really think about it, and we always really think about, there is a consistent thread going back honestly to Dinkins, Koch, all the way through of consistent issues coming up, consistent similar solutions. I know Mayor Dinkins fought for control of education also. So it really does build on it. So yes, there are going to be changes, and there should be changes. There's a great opportunity to relook at issues like homelessness, which is incredibly important, probably in terms of something that must be done tomorrow. One of the most important things. But whether I agree or not agree with what was done before is one matter. But all of it really has built on much of the previous administrations. I should say much is built on all of the previous administrations, to put it the right way. And it really has, whether it be appointments and so on. It's a lot of recycling the same people, building on the old ideas and making them better. It's one of the things that I think makes a city great, is really building and having the same people who are familiar, like the people around this table, people sitting out there, familiar with the past of the city and building on it. So.
As Mayor Dinkins comes up to close us out, I want to take the privilege of the moderator to answer that question very quickly. I wrote a piece for Reuters on what Mayor de Blasio should build on from the Dinkins. Well, I would have done it for the Dinkins administration too, but for the Bloomberg administration. And I agree with a lot of what the panel has said. The focus on crime needs to continue. We need to continue diversifying our economy and linking it to workforce development. The workforce development system was transformed under Bloomberg, and we need to continue that. And of course, Plan NYC and our focus on environmental policy should continue unabated. And finally, I have to recognize in the audience my colleague, Jeannie Mulgrave, who was commissioner for the Department of Youth and Community Development for 12 years under Michael Bloomberg, and who I had the pleasure of working with on after-school reform. Please, Mayor de Blasio, continue the good work of Jeannie Mulgrave. And on that note, I would like to thank our panelists for this just extraordinary panel. Amazing. And really bring back our Mayor Dinkins. He is my mayor. I know he's all of yours, Mayor, and we're thrilled that you convened this forum again this year and brought Mayor de Blasio to campus, but more importantly, that you're here working with us, still teaching students, and making a tremendous impact on New York City, the state, the nation, and the globe. Thank you, Mayor Dinkins.
Well, if I had Esther making comments about me like this more often, I would have been reelected. I want to, of course, thank Esther, who from day one, not just this panel, but all the others, she has been involved in making it happen. I thank my friends, each of whom is a very special person. And I want to thank Linda Hamilton, who's probably gone to, oh, she's here, good. Linda's been working awfully hard on this, and when we have these forums each year, but all the rest of the work goes on, and she gets it done. So I'm very grateful. I'm pleased that our president, Lee Bollinger, was here. He doesn't have to make these things, but it was nice of him to be here. Our new dean is doing a great job, and I was very pleased that she participated. And I just want to make one final comment. The quality of this audience is absolutely amazing. I don't know whether you know who's here, but I look around, and like Dr. Redliner, who spoke a moment ago, is the founder of the Children's Health Fund. I mean, you see these big blue vans, buses really, that travel around, and I say we because I'm privileged to be on the board now. We have them in other jurisdictions. After Katrina hit, we raised money and added one down in New Orleans. You look around, there's David, there's Irwin still with us, good. Here's David Goodman. He just gave me a copy of a book about his mother, Carolyn Goodman. His older brother is the Goodman of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. And you know what a tragedy that was. I look around, and my God, there's the famous Skip Hartman, who probably has done more to help young people not just learn tennis, but learn how to cope with life. And he's been doing it for at least 40 years that I know of. And pardon me, I could go on and on like this, but I won't. I promise I won't. And I notice all these doctors sitting together here, all you people with doctorates. And as my friends know, I think a PhD in tiddlywinks is an accomplishment. So I'm very pleased that you're all here. But you see, I look out at you, and I know what impact you have in your immediate areas of concern and others, and I multiply this. And so it means to me that an awful lot of people care, and we will get it done. We've got to keep on working. We in our administration were able to get some things done, not because of me. I was just a guy out front, but I had a lot of wonderful people like Carol O'Clarican, Dr. Carol O'Clarican, who worked with us, Basil Patterson, who's gone now. He was the chairman of the mayor's committee on the judiciary, and he would bring me 3 or 4 names if I had 1 or 2 appointments to make of judges to the criminal court and family court. And it didn't matter who I picked. Didn't matter, because he brought all quality people. So during our administration, we're pleased that we had more women, more gays, more minorities than ever before. But it wasn't me, it was Basil Patterson. I'll take credit for picking him, but how's Miggle? It's Gretchen Buckenholz there. One of her children is little Miggle. I've known since she was that high, and bless her heart. She is the founder of Association to Benefit Children. I'm privileged to be on that board. Mrs. Diallo is here. You know Amadou Diallo, you all remember that. 41 rounds fired, 19 of them hit him, and he was doing not a damn thing but reaching for his wallet. Anyway, I could go on and on like this, but the point I wish to make to those of you whose names I've called and to the rest of you is this is a quality audience. Many people have gone, but it says to me that people genuinely care. And I can only say that when we fought to get Safe Streets, Safe City, Judge Milton Mullen, former presiding justice of the Appellate Division and Second Department, who resigned to come work with us, and we went to Albany, and one white Republican state senator, when we said people are dying in the streets, he said, "Mr. Mayor, my constituency is concerned with auto theft and graffiti." But we surmounted that, and we got the legislation, and crime started to go down as early as '91. But it wasn't me, it was a collective group of us who did wonderful, wonderful work. So one can feel sort of sad as we listen to our panelists tell us what we need to do and then tell us, but I don't know how the hell you're going to do it because we have this problem and that problem and the other problem. We do have those problems, but we will surmount it. We will surmount it, not simply because Bill de Blasio is a good person, but because of all the rest of you. We will insist that it be done. So thank you for your attendance, your interest. God bless you.